When I bought the house on Cedar Ridge Lane, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for quiet. After 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers and a divorce that left me emotionally hollow, I craved a place where I could breathe, grow tomatoes, and maybe finally learn how to be still. My son Daniel had just started law school 2 states over, and I figured if I planted deep enough roots, he'd have a reason to visit more than just the holidays. The house was modest, built in the 70s, but it had good bones, and more importantly, a wide backyard with south-facing exposure perfect for a vegetable garden. The lawn was patchy when I moved in, but I didn't care. I cared about the soil and the water. The property came with a private irrigation line tied to the old municipal runoff system grandfathered in from before the HOA even existed. I didn't think much of the HOA at first. Their welcome letter was condescending but harmless standard suburban fare. Rules about lawn height garbage bins approved paint colors. I'd spent most of my life around men who barked orders and expected results, so a newsletter typed in Comic Sans with phrases like community cohesion didn't exactly rattle me. But then I met her, Karen. Her real name was Karen, and I know what that name means these days, but trust me, she earned every syllable. She lived directly next door in a beige, stucco house with 4 hanging ferns on her porch and wind chimes that clattered even on breathless days. She introduced herself the day after I moved in, no pie, no handshake, just a warning about our standards and how she expected me to follow them. She gestured vaguely toward my truck in the driveway and said, "We don't really do the rugged look here." I smiled. I'd learned long ago that some people mistook silence for agreement, and I wasn't about to correct her on day 1. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I started laying out my garden beds, digging irrigation trenches, installing timers and drip lines. Nothing flashy, just solid engineering. Years in the field had taught me how to make water bend to my will, and I took pride in watching the soil darken each morning at precisely 5:30 a.m. My tomatoes sprouted quickly. The cucumbers took root. I even planted lavender along the edge of the yard, more for the bees than myself. It was peaceful until it wasn't. About a month in, I noticed something odd. The soil was dry. Not all of it just in one bed near the fence that separated my yard from Karen's. I checked the drip lines. No leaks, no clogs. But the pressure seemed low. It was like something was pulling the water before it reached the end of the line. I shrugged it off. Maybe the line had settled. I adjusted the valve, increased the flow slightly, and moved on. 2 days later, same problem. Different spot. This time the pressure was fine at first, but an hour later the line was sputtering. I walked the perimeter. The control box hadn't been touched. The main valve was sealed. But something wasn't right. Then I heard it. The soft hiss of water, not in my yard, but beyond the fence. I stepped up on an overturned bucket and looked over. Karen's lawn was glistening. Saturated. Too saturated. At 6:45 in the morning, her sprinklers weren't even on. Yet her entire front hedge line looked freshly watered. I stared. I waited. And then I saw it, a small plume of water misting up from behind her shed. A makeshift outlet hose, plastic cheap and barely hidden behind a row of potted succulents. She was siphoning my water. At first I thought, no, that's crazy. Maybe she had her own system. Maybe it was just runoff. But that night I couldn't sleep. Something was gnawing at me. So I walked outside with a flashlight and turned off my main irrigation valve. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., I stood by the fence and waited. At 5:36, Karen stepped outside in a pink bathrobe, sipping her coffee. She didn't see me. She walked over to the side of her yard, bent down behind the shed, and stared at something confused. She tapped her foot. Then she stomped back inside. By 6:00, she was standing in my driveway. "You shut off the water," she snapped. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to see if she'd admit it. "I beg your pardon," I finally said. "The HOA irrigation system," she said. "You're on the shared grid. It's extremely rude to tamper with a community utility." That was when I realized 2 things. 1, she had no idea what she was talking about. And 2, she was going to lie to my face and pretend she had the right. I told her calmly that the irrigation line on my property was private, and that I'd verified that in the county records. I even offered to show her the plat map. She waved me off. "I don't have time for whatever games you're playing," she said, turning on her heel. "But you'll be hearing from the HOA." She meant it. The next week, I received a notice of violation. Not for anything I'd done, but for disruption of common resource and non-cooperative water usage. It was signed by the HOA chair, Karen. By the time I received the second violation notice, this one citing failure to maintain equitable landscaping standards, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding or some delusional power trip from a bored neighbor. This was coordinated, intentional, a water war dressed up in bureaucratic language. I'd spent enough time overseas rebuilding infrastructure in war zones to know when someone was trying to control the battlefield without firing a shot. And in this cul-de-sac, Karen had chosen her battlefield, my water. The pressure issues got worse. One morning, the drip line failed completely. My cucumbers wilted like they'd been left in the sun for days. My tomato stalks curled at the edges. The soil was bone dry, despite the timer confirming that the system had activated. I opened the main valve box, thinking maybe the solenoid had failed. What I found instead stopped me cold. The line had been tampered with. Not in an obvious way, no severed pipes or busted couplings. No, this was subtle. A splice expertly tucked behind the meter panel with an offshoot line running underground toward Karen's property. I followed it carefully, my fingers tracing the PVC like a surgeon in a war zone. It was newer than my system, and definitely not from the original installation. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I didn't know whether to feel insulted or impressed. I turned off the water entirely. I needed to be sure. I spent the next day documenting every inch of the setup. I dug up the old irrigation schematics from the county's online property records, cross-referenced them with satellite photos, and then printed them out. Karen's house wasn't on the original grid, not even close. The line that ran through my yard was installed in 1974, before Cedar Ridge Lane had ever been part of a homeowners association. It had been a private agricultural line left intact when the zoning changed. When I purchased the house, the property deed clearly stated that the irrigation system was included as part of a privately maintained utility. There was no HOA access, no shared line, no common usage. So the idea that I was disrupting a community resource wasn't just false, it was fabricated. Still, I knew better than to confront her again with only words. I needed evidence. Real, indisputable proof. I drove to the hardware store that afternoon and bought a high-sensitivity flow meter, a digital pressure gauge, and a small Wi-Fi camera, one of those birdhouse-style security units you could mount in a tree. When the clerk rang me up, he asked if I was starting a backyard project. Something like that, I muttered. That night, under cover of darkness, I installed the camera in my red maple tree, angling it perfectly toward the fence, where the mystery line disappeared underground. I installed the pressure sensor directly onto the outbound irrigation valve, connected it to a mobile alert system, and configured the flow meter to log every drop that exited the valve. The next morning, I set the timer to activate at 5:30 a.m., then turned off all sprayers, drip lines, and spigots. The system would pump water, but nowhere on my side would receive it. At 5:38, I got the notification. Flow detected, moderate volume. Pressure dropped by 11 psi within 90 seconds. At 5:39, the pressure spiked, then flatlined. Someone had opened a valve and then shut it. It was deliberate, timed. I refreshed the camera feed, and there she was. Karen, in her pink robe, crouched behind her hydrangeas, twisting a small valve at the end of a green hose, a hose I now knew had been illegally connected to my water line. I watched her hold her hand out under the nozzle, testing the pressure. She smiled. That smile burned itself into my brain. I downloaded the footage, archived it to a flash drive, then made 3 backups, one for me, one for a lawyer if needed, and one for my son, just in case anything escalated. The next morning, I sent a certified letter to the HOA's official mailbox, addressed to the board and Karen personally. It included printed photos, a short explanation, and a scanned copy of the property utility map. No threats, no demands, just facts. By that afternoon, Karen was at my door again, but this time with backup the vice president of the HOA. A lanky guy named Greg who looked like he spent more time practicing passive aggression than enforcing community standards. "We're here to address your recent claims," he said, blinking as if saying the word claims pained him. I invited them to step off my porch and follow me to the irrigation box. I opened it, showed them the meter, the pressure log. Then I handed them the printout of the map, the one with the original pipe layouts, and my property's deed rights clearly highlighted. Karen scoffed. Greg stared. I waited. Finally, Greg cleared his throat. Well, perhaps the system was modified over time. We should all be willing to compromise. After all, this is a community. I cut him off. Compromise implies mutual benefit. Theft does not. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. I've documented the unauthorized line. I have footage. I'm offering you both the chance to fix this privately before I pursue legal action. That's not a threat. It's a courtesy. Karen turned red. Greg adjusted his glasses. We'll review the situation with the board, he said. They walked away, but not before Karen hissed just loud enough for me to hear, "You think you're so clever. This isn't over." She was right. It wasn't. But I had the high ground now, and I wasn't finished. Not even close. Karen didn't wait long to strike back. Just 2 days after our tense confrontation, I received another violation notice, this one absurd even by HOA standards. Unauthorized surveillance equipment, it read. Apparently, my birdhouse camera, the same one catching her red-handed, was now being classified as aesthetic pollution that violated neighborhood harmony. It was laughable. But I wasn't laughing. The notice came with a $150 fine and a threat of escalating penalties if the device wasn't removed within 48 hours. I scanned the rest of the letter and nearly choked on my coffee when I saw the signature at the bottom. Karen L. Morton, Chair, Cedar Ridge HOA Beautification Committee. Beautification Committee. The irony was unbearable. I wasn't surprised she'd leveraged the HOA's bylaws to retaliate. What did surprise me, though, was how fast the board backed her. I'd always assumed that HOAs were annoyingly slow bureaucracies, the kind that took 6 weeks to approve a mailbox repaint. But in Karen's case, it was as if her complaints went through a VIP express lane. I started digging. Every HOA meeting minutes document I could get my hands on, archived PDFs on the association's clunky website, had her fingerprints all over them. Motions she proposed, votes she pushed through. Even a bizarre amendment from 3 years prior granting the Beautification Committee chair the power to issue temporary code revisions for emergency visual integrity. It was a Karen clause, written for her by her. She didn't just live next door, she ran the show. I called the city to ask about jurisdiction. The man on the line, a weary-sounding public records clerk, explained that while the city couldn't interfere directly in HOA enforcement, unless laws were being broken, I could file a complaint if I believed the HOA was exceeding its authority. And who enforces that, I asked. Typically the courts, he said. Or sometimes the pressure of a formal letter from a lawyer is enough to get them to back off. He paused. Sir, if I may, are you the gentleman with the water siphoning issue? I sat up straighter. Yes, he sighed. You're not the first. She's got a reputation. But she's careful, knows how to work within the HOA gray zones. That night I called Daniel. My son answered on the third ring, clearly in the middle of studying. I heard pages flipping, keyboards clacking. Dad, what's up? I told him everything. The water theft, the camera, the retaliation notices. He was quiet for a few seconds. Let me guess. She's not just a board member, she is the board. Bingo, I said. Daniel asked me to scan and email everything I had, the irrigation maps, HOA letters, camera footage, even the violation notices. I'll take a look this weekend, he said. There might be ways to pressure them without court. Procedural overreach, selective enforcement, even breach of fiduciary duty. I'd forgotten for a moment just how sharp he'd become. When he was younger, Daniel used to follow me into the garage and ask questions about valves and flow rates. Now he spoke in legal terms, procedural leverage, civil torts, evidentiary burden. And I needed every bit of that. The next day, I received a notice from the HOA demanding that I schedule a compliance inspection. According to the letter, it was to assess whether my property had become a source of aesthetic degradation and a drain on community cohesion. That wasn't a code violation. That was an insult in legal clothing. They scheduled the inspection for 9:00 a.m. sharp on Saturday, conveniently the one day a week I usually spoke to Daniel face-to-face via video call. They knew what they were doing. At 8:55 a.m. that Saturday, Karen arrived on my lawn with 2 other HOA board members, Greg the VP, and a woman named Monica the secretary, who looked like she hadn't smiled since 2003. I invited them into the yard. I didn't offer coffee. Karen immediately started nitpicking. There's a visible hose on the side yard. That should be wound and secured. She pointed at my compost pile. Unscreened compost. That's a health hazard. Then the pièce de resistance. The birdhouse appears to contain unauthorized surveillance equipment. I handed her a notarized copy of my property survey, which stated clearly that the tree and everything mounted on it were fully within my boundary lines. She refused to take it. Monica scribbled something down on a clipboard. Greg stared at the compost like it had personally offended him. I let them continue. Let them walk the perimeter, murmuring and marking violations like medieval tax collectors. Then, just as they were about to leave, I handed Greg a USB drive. "What's this?" he asked. "Footage," I said, "of illegal siphoning from my irrigation system, with timestamps and pressure readings, and documentation showing I own the system." Karen flushed instantly. "You're recording me now?" "You're on my property," I said calmly. "But don't worry, this footage was from last week, when you were on yours." Greg hesitated. He didn't want to take it. But eventually, Monica reached over and plucked the drive from my hand, tucking it into a manila folder with the rest of their documents. As they turned to leave, Karen sneered at me. "You're going to regret playing these games." But that's just it. I wasn't playing. I was preparing. And she had just stepped onto the field I knew better than anyone: systems, pressure, cause, and effect. This wasn't about watering a lawn anymore. It was about breaking the HOA's hold with every drop of stolen water as proof. After the inspection circus, I spent most of that weekend going through my garage like an old war general preparing for a siege. Decades of service had taught me the value of documentation, not just what you knew, but what you could prove. And I wasn't going to rely solely on a USB drive and a few maps downloaded off a county website. If this was going to escalate, I needed every angle covered: historical, legal, technical. I opened my old field chest, the one I hadn't touched since my last tour in Kandahar. Inside were rolled blueprints, topographical maps, a handheld GPS, and a waterproof binder full of construction records, my own personal archive of everything I'd built, surveyed, or consulted on. I'd even kept my surveying certificate from '94. At the bottom was an old brass compass Daniel had given me when he was 10, engraved with 4 words: "Know where you stand always." I took that as a sign. Back inside, I combed through the original property deed and located the utility easement section. The language was clear: the irrigation system was private, not shared. And then I found something even more useful, a document from 1982 signed by the original developer stating that all subterranean water lines servicing parcels on lots 15 through 18 shall remain under sole ownership and maintenance by said parcel owners. My home was lot 17, Karen's was lot 19. She wasn't just siphoning, she had no legal right to even touch that system. I snapped photos of the document, sent copies to Daniel, and added it to the growing binder I was now calling the HOA Warbook. That Monday morning, I took a trip down to City Hall. The records clerk, the same one I'd spoken to before, recognized me instantly. He gave me a tight smile and gestured toward a back office. "I figured you'd be back," he said. "You're not the first guy to have a Karen problem, but you might be the first one documenting it this well." He pulled the subdivision development plan from a dusty drawer and rolled it out across a long table. Here he pointed, tapping a long, winding line in faded blue ink. "This is the main HOA line installed in '97 when the Cedar Ridge HOA was officially formed. See this branching line? That's yours, installed way earlier. Not connected to theirs at all. In fact, the city grandfathered your system into the exemption clause because it predates the HOA charter." He paused, leaned in closer. "If she's tapped into that line, that's trespass, tampering with utility infrastructure, and possibly criminal mischief, depending on intent." I nodded slowly. "You mind if I scan this and take a copy?" He grinned. "I already did. Figured you'd ask." By noon, I had official city schematics, a notarized property deed, and legal precedent stacked thicker than HOA bylaws. And Karen. She was still smiling and waving to neighbors, pretending she wasn't actively stealing from the guy next door. I was back at my kitchen table when Daniel called. He'd reviewed everything. "This is textbook abuse of power," he said. "She's manipulating her role to intimidate you, enforce bogus violations, and cover up what amounts to theft of resources. That birdhouse camera, totally legal. She has no expectation of privacy while siphoning water on her property." "What about the inspection?" I asked. "Pure intimidation. The HOA has the right to inspect properties for violations, but not to use inspections to retaliate against whistleblowers. That's selective enforcement. And with that development plan, you can argue she's violated both civil code and your property rights. I leaned back and exhaled. So what's next? You have two options, he said. You can file a formal cease and desist with the HOA and notify them that you're preparing legal action. Or I asked, or you turn up the pressure in your own way. The pause on the line wasn't silence. It was permission. I stared out the window at the fence line, the spot where her hose had vanished beneath the soil like a thief at night. She wanted to play dirty fine. I'd play by the rules, my rules. The kind they didn't teach in HOA meetings, but I'd learned in forward operating bases and disaster zones. The next morning, I made two key upgrades to my irrigation system. First, I installed a pressure valve with a check system so that anything leaving my property could be redirected, measured, and if needed, dosed with something unpleasant but harmless. Then I mixed a solution distilled white vinegar and food-grade blue dye. Both biodegradable, both legal, both completely safe. But when combined, strong enough to stain grass for days and leave a stench so sharp it could peel paint. I tested the mix on a patch of dirt behind the shed. The smell hit my nostrils like a slap, acrid, acidic, exactly what I needed. I let the system run dry for one more day, just to give her confidence. I even left my gate open to give her the illusion I wasn't watching anymore. Then at 5:29 a.m. the next day, I turned on the main valve and flipped the bypass switch. Pressure surged. At 5:32, I received the flow alert. She was tapping in again. And this time I was ready. I watched on the camera as Karen emerged from her house 10 minutes later, coffee in hand, fluffing her robe like a suburban queen surveying her domain. She took a few steps onto her lawn, then froze. The grass was blue. Electric blue. Neon and unmistakable, a bold declaration of guilt made visible to the entire block. I leaned back and sipped my coffee as she ran to the side yard, dropped to her knees, and screamed something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. Her hands were stained, her slippers soaked. The best part, that smell. I knew it would stick to the grass, to her shoes, to her porch steps, the lingering scent of justice. But I wasn't done. I printed stills from the footage and attached them to a formal complaint, not just to the HOA, but to the city's code enforcement office. I included maps, pressure logs, timestamps, and a short letter signed by me. And this letter is to notify you of repeated documented theft and tampering involving privately owned utility systems, as well as coordinated retaliatory behavior by an HOA officer. I request a formal investigation and await your reply. Within 48 hours, I received a call from the city. They were sending an inspector. The city inspector arrived on a Thursday morning, driving a dust-covered white SUV with the municipal seal stamped on the side. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with rolled-up sleeves and a clipboard wedged under one arm. His name was Mr. Jared Holloway, and he introduced himself with the polite but guarded tone of someone used to mediating between feuding neighbors. I met him at the curb and led him straight to the irrigation control box. "I've got everything labeled," I said, popping open the metal hatch. "This is the pressure regulator. Here's the original valve, and this is the bypass I installed with a digital flow sensor." He crouched down and examined it all carefully. "You installed this yourself?" "I did. 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. Built systems like this in Baghdad and Bosnia. This one's pretty simple by comparison." He gave a low whistle, impressed despite himself. Then he pulled out his phone and took several photos of the setup. "You're claiming someone tapped into this line illegally?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I'm not claiming it," I replied, holding up a tablet. "I'm proving it." I showed him the video footage, Karen crouching beside her hydrangeas, twisting the valve on that hose connection. The timestamps matched the flow meter logs. The water usage spike. The drop in pressure. The discoloration of her lawn. All of it documented, cataloged, and neatly packaged like a military field report. He nodded as he watched scribbling notes in tight block handwriting on his inspection sheet. "Do you have property documentation?" "Here," I said, handing him the binder. "Deed, original easement, the 1982 developer letter, and a scanned copy of the municipal utility plan. You'll find that my irrigation system was grandfathered in. It's private, not part of the HOA system." He flipped through the pages, stopping occasionally to read a highlighted paragraph or examine a diagram. "This is solid," he muttered, "really solid." He closed the binder and looked up at me. "I'll have to do a site visit to her property to confirm any cross connections, but based on what you've shown me, yeah. This looks like clear tampering. Will you notify her, I asked. I have to. But she'll be given a chance to respond. If she refuses access, we escalate. Either way, the city has jurisdiction over underground utility violations, HOA or not. That was the moment I felt the tide shift. Not a victory yet, but momentum. Mr. Holloway spent the next hour walking the property lines, measuring distances, confirming the blueprints with physical landmarks. When he finished, he shook my hand and promised to follow up within a week. As he drove away, Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at me over her railing. Her lawn was still stained a ghostly blue-green despite the sprinkler she'd run every morning in a desperate attempt to rinse away the evidence. That afternoon, the neighborhood started buzzing. It began with Whisper's parents walking kids to the bus stop, pausing at the end of my driveway, glancing at the blue-tinged grass across the street. A man I barely knew from 3 doors down leaned out of his car window and said, "Hey, did you do that on purpose?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The next day, a woman named Ruth, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, knocked on my door holding a tray of lemon bars. She lived 2 streets over and had once served as secretary of the HOA before, according to her, Karen staged a coup. She handed me the lemon bars and said I've been waiting years for someone to stand up to that woman. Thank you. By Saturday, word had spread like wildfire. People who'd never spoken to me before were waving as they walked by. A couple of them even stopped to ask questions. Is it true she rerouted your pipes? Do you think the HOA knew? Can we see the footage? I didn't show them. Not yet. But I could feel the shift in power, a subtle unraveling of the iron grip Karen had kept on the community for years. The following Monday, I received a letter from the city's Code Enforcement Department. It was formal stamped and beautifully worded. An unauthorized irrigation cross-connection has been confirmed between Parcel 19 and Parcel 17 in violation of City Municipal Code 12.4.3 AA. A cease and desist order has been issued to the offending party along with a mandatory remediation schedule. Attached was a second notice. Should the HOA or its representatives continue to interfere with private utility, infrastructure, or retaliate against the property owner, further investigation will be initiated under the City Charter's Abuse of Authority Clause. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Daniel, who replied within minutes, "Frame it." I almost did. That night, I walked to the edge of my backyard and stood by the fence. The hose connection on Karen's side was gone now, removed hastily, leaving a patch of disturbed soil like a bad memory someone tried to bury. I thought about letting it go. I really did. But then the sprinkler on my west side sputtered again. I checked the meter. Pressure drop. Again. I couldn't believe it, even with the inspector's warning, even with the city's notice, she was still trying. That's when I realized something important. Karen wasn't just arrogant. She was desperate. She couldn't admit defeat because her entire identity was built on control, and the moment she lost it, everything else would unravel. So I prepared the final test, a decoy valve. I installed a false connection, something that looked like a functional pipe but actually fed from a closed-loop reservoir. No real water, just a trap. And in that reservoir, I mixed a stronger concentration of vinegar and dye, harmless, still food grade, but potent enough to stain anything it touched for days. I baited the hook and waited. 3 days later, I got the ping. 5:37 a.m. Pressure activated. Valve turned. Camera rolling. Karen in her robe again. Same smile, same smug posture. Until she screamed. The footage was priceless. Her hand yanked back like she'd touched acid. Blue streaks splattered her sleeve. Her porch step now had a brilliant teal splotch that wouldn't wash out for a week. That afternoon, I emailed the footage to the city inspector this time, with the subject line, "Continued violation. Evidence attached." I CC'd the HOA board. By evening, I received a reply from Greg, the HOA vice president. It was 3 lines long. "We are formally suspending Karen Morton from all committee duties pending an internal review. We thank you for your patience." It wasn't justice yet, but it was getting close. The morning I turned the valve, really turned. It wasn't planned out like a heist. It wasn't some grand strategic operation like the ones I used to brief with satellite maps and unit overlays. No, this one was simple, quiet, personal. I stood in my garage at 5:10 a.m., coffee in hand, staring at the old irrigation control panel that now looked more like a command center. The blue dye solution was ready, 2 gallons, mixed with just the right concentration of vinegar, balanced, to avoid killing the grass, but strong enough to leave a trail. I'd tested it on a patch of gravel behind the compost bin, and it still hadn't faded after 4 days. I'd given her warnings. I'd filed complaints. I'd presented documents, maps, video footage, and pressure readings. I'd even stood calmly while she called me aggressive, unneighborly, and uncooperative in front of the entire HOA board. But she wouldn't stop. And the city's cease and desist order, as firm as it looked on paper, had done little more than bruise her pride. She was still stealing water, and I was done asking nicely. At 5:28 a.m., I walked outside into the quiet cold. The streetlights hummed above Cedar Ridge Lane, casting pale orange light on empty sidewalks. A light breeze rustled the leaves in my maple tree where the birdhouse camera silently recorded. I knelt beside the pipe junction, unscrewed the pressure regulator cap, and fitted the reservoir canister into place. A final twist. A soft hiss. The solution was flowing. Then I turned the valve and waited. I didn't need to check the camera. I knew what would happen. I knew she was watching my irrigation schedule. She'd gotten bold lately, tapping in as soon as the water started flowing like a hawk circling a mouse the moment it twitched. At 5:35 a.m., the flow meter buzzed. She'd activated her siphon. 2 minutes later, the pressure dipped again lower this time, like she was drawing heavy. Probably her front lawn and side yard. Perfect. At 5:40, I walked back inside, poured another cup of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table like nothing was happening. 10 minutes later, I heard the scream. It wasn't faint. It was sharp, guttural, cut through the morning silence like a siren. I didn't move. Then came the yelling. Not at me, not yet, but loud enough that it echoed across the houses. Something about staining everything, and that man is insane. I waited. At 6:02 a.m., she came storming down my driveway. No robe this time. She wore leggings and a sweatshirt that was now stained with long streaks of turquoise blue across the sleeves. Her hands were blotched palms, still wet. She looked like she'd tried to dye Easter eggs barehanded in a vinegar storm. She didn't knock, she pounded. I opened the door halfway. "What in God's name did you do?" she shrieked. I sipped my coffee. "Good morning, Karen. You poisoned my lawn. You vandalized my property." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the lawn that's connected to my irrigation system?" Her mouth opened, then closed again. I didn't wait. I held up the pressure log from that morning. 5:28 a.m. activation. 5:35 siphon detected. 5:36 unauthorized flow initiated from your side. I didn't touch your property. I simply changed the contents of mine. She was shaking not from cold but fury. "I'm calling the police," she spat. "You're welcome to," I said. "Just know that the city inspector has already confirmed a violation on your part. Tampering with private utility infrastructure is a misdemeanor offense under municipal code. You might want to consult the paperwork they sent last week." Her hand trembled around her phone. "This is war," she whispered. I met her eyes. "It was never supposed to be. You made it one." She stormed off without another word, tracking blue footprints across the concrete as she went. I watched her march back across the street, her posture twitching with frustration, her arms stiff. She was unraveling, and she knew it. Her status, her control, her reputation, it was all slipping like dye into her topsoil. An hour later, the HOA board showed up. Greg first, in his usual khakis and polo, his face tight with discomfort. Monica followed, clipboard clutched like a shield. They didn't knock either, just stood at the edge of my property, uncertain as if my lawn had become radioactive. Mr. Davis, Greg began. "We're aware of the situation involving Ms. Morton. She's requested an emergency board session." "Let me guess," I said. "To charge me with something." Greg hesitated. "She believes you've intentionally sabotaged her property." I folded my arms. "And do you believe her?" Silence. Monica finally spoke. "We received a notice from the city inspector this morning. He included a summary of the second violation, the new siphon attempt. He also copied in the city attorney." "So you know," I said. Greg nodded slowly. "We know." I stepped forward. "Let me make this easy for you. I have video footage. I have documentation. I have timestamps. I have city backing. But what I really want is peace. I moved here for quiet, to tend my garden talk to my son, and maybe finally have a place that feels like mine." Greg swallowed. We're reviewing everything, internally. Good, I said. Because if I get one more bogus violation notice, I'll forward the entire case file to the state HOA regulatory board and every news outlet between here and Sacramento. They left without another word. Karen didn't show her face for 3 days. When she did, she walked briskly to her mailbox, kept her head down, and bolted back inside. Her lawn was patchy now, some parts still bright green-blue, others browning under the shock of vinegar. And I went back to my garden. The lavender was thriving, tomatoes starting to set, and for the first time in weeks, the water pressure was perfect. By the time Karen's bright green lawn had fully transformed into a turquoise-stained mess, the neighborhood no longer had questions, only whispers. It started with the obvious, the color. No filter on earth could mute the intensity of that unnatural blue-green hue streaked across her precious St. Augustine grass. The lawn had been her pride, her stage. Every spring she'd plant imported perennials, edge the walkway with precision, and even win the HOA's self-declared Yard of the Month award 3 years in a row. But now, it looked like a chemical spill at a Smurf funeral. And Karen, for all her attempts at damage control, couldn't scrub the stain from her lawn or her reputation. I watched it all unfold from my front porch, cup of black coffee in hand. That porch had become my perch, a front-row seat to suburban downfall. Daniel joked over the phone that I was turning into Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino, minus the racism, plus the irrigation engineering. The best part, I didn't need to say a single word. Not to her, not to the HOA. The neighborhood was doing it for me. On Wednesday morning, a group of neighbors walking their dogs paused across from her driveway. They didn't speak loudly, but their sideways glances, the awkward chuckles, and the sudden silence when Karen stepped outside were more deafening than anything I could have shouted. She tried to pretend it wasn't happening, at first, wore oversized sunglasses, kept her head down, mowed the lawn twice in 3 days, hoping it would somehow clip the color away. But all it did was push the dye deeper into the soil. Then came the meltdown. It was Saturday, 9:03 a.m. The sun had just started burning off the fog. I was on my knees in the backyard harvesting cucumbers and plucking dead leaves when I heard the first shout. "Are you all blind?" I stood and wiped my hands on a rag. "I've been harassed, lied to you, people treat him like a hero, but he's the criminal." I stepped around the side of the house, in time to see her standing barefoot in her flip-flops, in the middle of her now blotchy lawn, screaming at the passing HOA secretary Monica and 2 other board members. Monica looked stunned. She tried to speak, but Karen kept going. "He poured chemicals on my property. That man's a lunatic. You're all just letting him do this." One of the board members said something I couldn't hear, and Karen shrieked back, "He made my lawn blue, blue." I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not loud, just a short breath through my nose, but she saw me. "You think this is funny?" she yelled across the street, pointing at me, with a hand still stained faintly green-blue. I didn't move, didn't say a word. She stormed up my driveway, barefoot fury radiating from her like heat off asphalt. "You're going to pay for this. I'll sue you. I'll have you arrested." I held up my phone. "You're on my property again, Karen. Might want to think twice." She stopped short. I could see the exact moment it hit her. Not just that she was losing, but that she'd already lost. Her power, her reputation, her ability to control the narrative, it was all gone. She backed away slowly, her voice quieter now. "I just wanted what was fair." "No," I said, stepping forward, my voice even. "You wanted control, and when you couldn't get it the easy way, you stole it. From me. From this neighborhood." She blinked at me, eyes welling with something close to tears, but it wasn't remorse. It was shame. She turned, nearly tripped, over the garden hose at the edge of my driveway, and fled back across the street. The door slammed behind her. I looked over to where Monica still stood. Her mouth opened slightly, like she might apologize, but she didn't. Instead, she just gave me the faintest nod. Later that afternoon, I received a letter, this time slipped into my mailbox by hand, no envelope. Just a folded page that smelled faintly of lavender. It was from Monica. "Mr. Davis, we the board owe you an apology. Karen's behavior does not reflect the values we claim to uphold. We've convened a special meeting to review her status. Please know that several of us were unaware of the extent of her actions until recently. Thank you for your patience, your evidence, and your restraint. Respectfully, Monica Reyes, Secretary, Cedar Ridge, HOA, That was the first real acknowledgement I'd received, and it changed something. The next day, Greg stopped by. He stood awkwardly near the sidewalk, holding a plastic folder like a kid about to confess he'd cheated on a math test. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, "about all of it." I nodded. "You were quiet for a long time, Greg." "I know," he admitted. "Karen, she's relentless. She's been running this place like her own kingdom. Most of us just stayed out of her way until the dye hit the grass." A small guilty chuckle escaped him. "Something like that." He handed me the folder. Inside was a copy of an internal memo from the HOA board, officially suspending Karen from all duties, pending a full vote for removal. Attached was a revised set of inspection guidelines with new language about retaliation and abuse of authority. "You're not just fixing a lawn," I said. "You're fixing the system." He smiled faintly. Better late than never, right? As he walked away, I looked down at my own yard flourishing vibrant, untouched by HOA meddling. The lavender was blooming again, this time in thick, fragrant clusters. My tomatoes were red ripe and proud. And for the first time in months, the street was quiet again. No shouting, no veiled threats, just the hum of sprinklers and the breeze through leaves. Peace. It smelled like mint and vinegar. Just when I thought the storm had passed, the HOA proved it still had teeth. Dull ones, maybe, but sharp enough to try and leave a scar. It began with a certified letter. Stamped and sealed, no signature. Official looking. The kind of document designed to shake people before they even open it. Inside a formal notice of pending sanctions from the Cedar Ridge HOA board. The accusation: malicious tampering with common use irrigation, intentional sabotage, and my personal favorite, creating an unsafe and hostile community environment. I reread the letter twice before I laughed out loud. Karen may have been suspended, but her fingerprints were all over this. The language, the tone, the legal posturing, it was her style down to the comma placement. But what shocked me wasn't that she was still trying. It was that the board was letting her. Greg's signature was at the bottom. So was Monica's. Both had stood on my property days earlier, eyes full of apologies. And now, here they were throwing me under the bus in 12-point Times New Roman. So much for spine. I wasn't angry, not yet. But I wasn't going to let it slide either. I called Daniel. He was in class, but he stepped out once I told him it was about a formal HOA action. "Send me the whole letter," he said. "PDF it. I want to read the exact phrasing." Within an hour, he called back, and he was livid. "Dad, this is pure garbage. Half of what they're accusing you of contradicts the city's own inspection findings. This isn't just weak, it's dangerous. They're opening themselves up to a liability suit." "Sounds like something you'd enjoy writing," I said. "Already started drafting the response," he replied. "But here's the kicker. I'm not just going to deny their claims. I'm going to turn their own rules against them." He was grinning through the phone. I could hear it. "You're going to cite the HOA charter." "Yep. Section 4.3, Board Member Conduct. Section 5.2, Abuse of Authority. And I'm adding a formal grievance for violating procedural neutrality." Do I even need to know what that means? Just means they're about to get a letter they won't forget. The next morning, I printed the letter he wrote. 3 pages. Clean, sharp, professionally formatted. It cited city code violations, included a timeline of events, listed attached evidence, video pressure logs, inspection results, and concluded with an ultimatum. Withdraw the pending sanctions immediately, or face legal action for defamation, abuse of process, and harassment. I hand-delivered it to the HOA office, a repurposed pool house on the east side of the subdivision, and left it with a clerk who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. By that evening, the board had called an emergency meeting. Greg called me personally to invite me to attend. "I think it's important that we clear the air," he said, voice tight. "I agree," I said. "You want me to bring my evidence folder or just the city inspector's statement? Bring whatever you think is appropriate." That was code for, "We're in trouble and we know it." The meeting was held in the rec center, a long rectangular room with cheap tile flooring and folding chairs lined up in uneven rows. Maybe 20 people showed. Most weren't board members. They were residents, neighbors, people who had watched the blue-stained lawn saga unfold from behind their hedges and now wanted to see what came next. I walked in with the binder under my arm, calm and unhurried. Greg stood at the front with a legal pad. Monica was beside him. Karen surprisingly wasn't present. I took a seat near the front, facing them squarely. "Thank you for coming." Greg began clearing his throat. We've convened this session to discuss the recent conflicts surrounding irrigation access and board enforcement procedures. Someone in the back, an older man with a veteran's cap, muttered, "You mean the water theft?" Greg flinched. Monica glanced down at her notes. I stood. "Before we begin," I said, voice steady, "I'd like to clarify a few facts for the record." I placed the binder on the table, flipped it open, and started laying out documents. City inspector's findings dated 2 weeks ago. Confirmed unauthorized siphon connection from Parcel 19 to Parcel 17. Whispers stirred through the room. Deed documentation. My irrigation system is private grandfathered in. HOA lines were installed over a decade later, and no shared agreement exists. More whispers. Video footage. I continued tapping a printed still of Karen twisting her siphon valve with timestamps matching pressure log anomalies on 5 separate dates. I looked up, meeting Greg's eyes. "And here," I said, holding up the cease and desist from the city, "is the part where your former beautification chair violated multiple municipal codes. Codes I reported, not retaliated for." Silence. No one dared interrupt. Then I held up Daniel's letter. "And finally, a formal legal response written with assistance from counsel rejecting the HOA's attempted sanctions and outlining your liability exposure should this pattern of harassment continue." Greg looked pale. Monica cleared her throat, but no words came out. "Mr. Davis," Greg finally said, we acknowledge the situation may have been mischaracterized." "No," I said, cutting him off. "You didn't mischaracterize it. You let Karen weaponize this board for years. You knew her tactics. You saw the videos, and you still signed off on a letter accusing me of misconduct." I looked around the room, at the neighbors, the onlookers, the faces that had silently watched this unfold. I have no intention of dragging this neighborhood into court. I moved here to grow tomatoes, not file lawsuits. But I will not be intimidated. And I will not be quiet when someone trespasses, steals, and then cries foul when caught. A beat passed. Then unexpectedly someone clapped. It started as a slow, deliberate clap from the man in the veteran's cap, then spread across the room. Greg shifted uncomfortably, then raised his hand for silence. "We will withdraw the sanctions," he said, "effective immediately. And we will begin a review of board procedures and committee powers, including the removal vote for Ms. Morton." He looked at me. "Is that acceptable?" I nodded. "Good," he said quietly. "Thank you for your diligence." But he didn't mean diligence. He meant relentlessness. And he wasn't wrong. The Monday after the emergency meeting, the HOA board issued an official memo to all residents of Cedar Ridge. It was dry, clinical, and carefully worded, the kind of language that tries to acknowledge chaos without admitting fault. But between the lines, it said everything. Effective immediately, Karen Morton was removed from all committee duties. The board would be undergoing a full policy audit and rewriting several enforcement procedures. Residents with concerns about water access, inspection, fairness, or prior citations were invited to submit complaints for review. They were in short scrambling to control the damage. And Karen? She had vanished. I didn't see her for a full week. Her blinds stayed drawn, her car unmoved. I thought maybe she was regrouping. Maybe she was meeting with a lawyer. But then on Friday afternoon, a U-Haul appeared in front of her house. She was moving out. No announcement, no farewell. Just a silent procession of cardboard boxes and plastic bins wheeled to the curb by a couple of teenage movers who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. I stood on my front porch and watched, arms crossed, a strange cocktail of emotions turning in my gut. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. I just felt clean. Like something foul had finally been scrubbed out of the street, leaving behind a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. That evening, Daniel arrived. He'd hinted at coming for a visit, but I didn't expect him so soon. He pulled up in his old silver Civic backpack slung over one shoulder and a binder full of legal notes in the other. "You timed that well," I said, hugging him. He smirked. "I figured I'd wait until the dust settled." "You missed the last fireworks by a day," I heard he said. "HOA Karen dethroned. Street rejoices." We sat on the back porch under the string lights I'd finally had time to install. The air smelled like fresh soil and mint. Daniel flipped through the binder, then closed it. "You know," he said, "what you did wasn't just a defense. It was a precedent." "A what?" "You didn't just protect yourself. You reminded the board that they answer to something higher than their own rules. The law, the city, common decency." I chuckled. Didn't feel like I was setting any precedents when I was mixing blue dye in a vinegar jug. "That was the fun part," he said. But everything else, the maps, the logs, the complaint letters, that was methodical, documented. You made it so airtight even their lawyer would have hesitated. He paused. I'm proud of you, Dad. That one hit me harder than any HOA letter ever could. We sat in silence for a moment, the sun dipping below the rooftops. Then he asked, what are you going to do next? I shrugged. Same thing I always wanted. Garden. Fix the porch. Maybe build that greenhouse I've been sketching. No more neighborhood drama. God, I hope not, I muttered. But as we spoke, a knock came at the front door. It was Ruth, the elderly woman from 2 streets over, the one who'd once brought lemon bars, and whispered thank you. This time she held a clipboard. Evening, she said, smiling warmly. I hope I'm not disturbing. Not at all, I said. Daniel, this is Ruth. Ruth, my son. They exchanged hellos. I wanted to ask a favor, she said. The board's forming a committee to rewrite our enforcement protocols. We need someone with, well, practical experience. Someone who's stood up to abuse of power. Who knows how systems work? I stared at the clipboard. You want me on the HOA? Not the board, she said quickly. Just an oversight committee. Temporary. You wouldn't have to issue violations or approve paint colors. Just help make sure no one like Karen ever gets to do what she did again. I looked over at Daniel. He smiled and raised an eyebrow. Could be fun. I sighed. I'll think about it. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with even that. As she walked away, Daniel nudged me with his elbow. Imagine that. You go from being the neighborhood's public enemy #1 to its de facto watchdog. I snorted. They better not expect me to smile while I'm doing it. You don't need to smile, he said. You just need to be fair. And you've already proven you're damn good at that. That night, I dug out a sketch pad and started drafting ideas for a greenhouse. Daniel sat beside me, flipping through inspection reports for fun like only a law student could. The world had shifted. The HOA still existed. The bylaws still ran dozens of pages. But something had cracked open, a curtain drawn back. People were asking questions. Neighbors who'd once looked the other way were now speaking up. Monica resigned a week later. Greg sent a handwritten apology. The board voted to reduce fines, streamline appeals, and post all meetings online. Karen's house sat empty for another month before the for sale sign went up. When it finally sold, a young couple moved in. They introduced themselves with banana bread and asked if I had any tips for growing tomatoes. I smiled. Plenty, I said, and one big one: don't steal water from your neighbors. They laughed, but I meant it, because justice, when earned the hard way, becomes something deeper than revenge. It becomes memory. And memory, when planted right, can grow into something a whole community benefits from. Spring came early that year. The frost lifted by mid-March, and the soil in my backyard turned soft and rich, like coffee grounds. I spent most mornings with my hands in the dirt rebuilding the raised beds Karen once tried to sabotage with her theft. Now, without her presence leaching water, the system ran perfectly. Every valve hissed in sync. Every drip line sang a slow, steady rhythm of control and care. Daniel had returned to school, but he called often. He'd printed my story, every detail, every letter, every violation, and used it as a case study for his property law seminar. He titled it Cedar Ridge versus the Quiet Veteran. His professor called it an elegant example of homeowner empowerment through civil leverage. I just called it getting my yard back. And that greenhouse, I built it. With a clear polycarbonate roof, cedar framing, and automatic vent windows, it stood behind my garden like a glass chapel. Inside, rows of basil, rosemary, and heirloom seedlings stretched their fragile limbs toward the light. I spent hours in there barefoot, on the concrete floor, listening to classical jazz, while trimming leaves and adjusting humidity levels. The HOA never said a word. In fact, they hadn't said much of anything to me in months. Greg stepped down quietly in May, citing stress. Monica left a month later after neighbors began questioning her role in the Karen era. A younger, quieter couple took over the board leadership, and for the first time in years, the HOA newsletter didn't read like a list of threats. They even changed the masthead, from preserving the vision of Cedar Ridge to supporting a better neighborhood. Subtle, but meaningful. Ruth kept her promise. The oversight committee became a real thing, small, voluntary, and open to all residents. I attended exactly 2 meetings, helped them rewrite the dispute appeal process, then handed off my notes to a retired accountant who'd once sued the HOA over flagpole height. She was tougher than I was. I liked her immediately. I didn't want power. I just wanted peace. One Sunday morning in June, I was kneeling in the front yard, transplanting a row of blue salvia. when a little girl stopped at the edge of my walkway. She was maybe 7 or 8, missing a front tooth, dragging a scooter behind her. She pointed to the blue flowers. "Are those magic?" she asked. I looked up, smiling. "They're called salvia. Not magic, just careful soil and clean water. My mom says they're the prettiest on the block." "Your mom has good taste." She nodded, satisfied, and zoomed away on her scooter. Her wheels left a faint trail in the dust, but I didn't mind. It would wash away with the next rain. Later that day, I stood at the edge of my property and looked across the street. Karen's house had sold. The young couple who moved in, Emily and Travis, had painted the shutters a cheerful green and installed a porch swing. They waved every time they saw me. Sometimes brought over baked goods. Sometimes asked for gardening tips. Sometimes just smiled. One afternoon, Travis stood on his porch admiring my greenhouse. "Thinking of building one," he said. "Yours is gorgeous." I walked over, clapped him on the shoulder. "I've got the blueprints in the garage. Happy to share." He grinned. "Heard this neighborhood used to be kind of intense." I didn't answer right away. Just looked around. The air was warm. Children played down the block. A neighbor mowed his lawn. A wind chime, the one Karen once hung, still jingled faintly in the distance. But it no longer annoyed me. It was just background now. Not a threat, not a warning. Just noise. "Things change," I said finally. And they had. The garden bloomed fuller than it ever had. Rows of tomatoes the size of fists. Bees dancing between lavender and mint. The salvia, the same blue as the dye I'd once used to mark injustice, stood tall and brilliant at the front border, now a permanent part of my landscape. A reminder, not of the war, but of the win. Sometimes justice doesn't come in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes in a letter. A laugh. A scream on a blue-stained lawn. Sometimes it's measured not in verdicts, but in silence. The kind of silence you earn. The kind that lets you sleep. At night, I sat on the back porch, whiskey in one hand, watching the greenhouse glow from the inside like a lantern. The irrigation system whispered beneath the soil, perfectly timed, perfectly calibrated. Every drop of water mine, flowing where it should when it should. I smiled. Not because I'd beaten the HOA, but because I'd reclaimed my space, my home. And with it, something even more precious, the quiet dignity of standing your ground, of knowing you were right, and of never letting anyone, not even a board, not even a Karen, steal from you what you've spent a lifetime building, especially not your peace.